Hey and welcome back. Now, before we move on any further and talk about things like streams, the net module, the HTTP module, and so on, we first have to take some time and understand a JavaScript object that Node.js gives us, and that is the EventEmitter object. So, what exactly is this EventEmitter object and what sort of problems it solves? Before I answer those questions, let's just very quickly include the object and use it. Now, I'm not going to do anything crazy here. I'm just going to include the object and use it just to have a working program with that object. So I'm going to say const EventEmitter equals require events like this. Now, let's not focus on what exactly is this file, is this events. We're going to take a look at the source code and see what exactly it exports and what are some of the other objects that we have available. So with this EventEmitter object that I have, what I could do right now is to define a class, define an object, and specify it in a way to inherit from this object. Now I want to use the ES6 class syntax to define my object and to inherit from this object. So I'm going to define my class. I'm going to call it emitter, which extends or inherits from this EventEmitter object, and it's just a class. So I'm just going to define an empty class. This is the same if you define an object and define the prototype of this object to point to the prototype of this object. So let's now move on. Now that I have my class emitter, I'm going to create a new instance of it using the new keyword. So I'm going to say const myEmitter, which I'm going to abbreviate it to just myE, equals new emitter like this. Now with my object in place, I could now make use of those methods that this object, this EventEmitter object, gives me. So I could say myE.on foo and a function. I know it's probably not going to make any sense to you, but just bear with me for a second and you're going to see how this works, and then I'll explain everything. So here in the console log, I want to say events occurred. Now, another important function that this EventEmitter object gives us is the emit function. So I could say myE.emit, the name of the event, which in this case is foo. So I want to say foo, and that's it. So I defined a listener for an event, and right here I am firing that event. So let's go ahead and run this program. I'm going to open up my terminal, and I have this code inside of this app.js file. So I'm going to say node app.js, and here we go. Events occurred. And actually, I'm going to change it to an events occurred to make it sound more natural. And I also missed C here. There we go. Now, this is the bare minimum that we have to understand about event emitters. The on, the emit methods, and also the way we inherit from this EventEmitter object. So let's first now discuss what exactly is this object, and why do we even have it in Node. Now, I want to make a point extra clear right now, and that is that this events file, this source code here, has nothing to do with the event loop, with libuv, with asynchronous code, and all of that stuff that we talked about in the previous video. This has been implemented all in just JavaScript, and there's no C++ behind it. In fact, you can go ahead and create your own EventEmitter object completely from scratch. Of course, given the fact that you know some advanced JavaScript concepts, but if you know, it's pretty easy to do that. You'll see what I mean when we take a look at its source code in just a minute. Now, this is just a pattern. This is just JavaScript, and the reason it's there is because, if you recall in the previous video, we said that Node.js is event-driven, meaning that you issue commands, instructions to the computer, and you wait to respond back to those commands in an asynchronous manner. Again, by asynchronous, we mean that your application will continue its work while waiting for those events. And this event-driven nature isn't something exclusive for Node. It's actually used in a lot of other software technologies, in a lot of other programming languages. One of the examples would be the operating system itself. The OS uses a lot of events, a lot of asynchronous stuff is actually happening in it. Let's take a look at one example in the operating system. So suppose that you have your hardware again. You have your CPU, your RAM, your storage, and your network card, which are all on a motherboard, and there is an operating system running on top of it. Now, your CPU, let's say that it has 2 cores, or it could only handle 2 threads. Now, each one of these orange rectangles could only do one thing at a time. Now, we could call them threads, a core. Let's not really worry about terminology. They're actually different things, but for now, let's just call them one of those things. It doesn't really matter. The important point here is that each one of them could only do one thing at a time. So if you run a for loop on one of these cores, that core is going to get completely occupied until it finishes that for loop. Okay. Let's also say that you have a keyboard attached to your system. Now, let's also assume that you have created all of this hardware and this operating system yourself completely from scratch. And now you want to handle what's going to happen if a user presses these keys on the keyboard. Now, generally, you could do it in 2 different ways. You could either do it synchronously or you could do it asynchronously. Now, if you want to do it synchronously, you have to allocate one of these cores just to be able to read from this keyboard. So one of these cores is going to constantly check your keyboard to see whether or not the user has pressed a key and then respond to that. So you're actually killing one of these precious cores just to be able to handle a simple thing such as reading from the keyboard. Now, this way that I talked about, which is the first way, is you're doing it in a synchronous manner. So you're constantly checking your keyboard for that thing to happen. Now, another thing you could do is to do this operation asynchronously, meaning that you're not going to constantly just allocate one of your cores to constantly check this keyboard. What you're going to do instead is that you're going to issue a command, issue something to your CPU whenever a user presses something on the keyboard. So in that case, imagine I press the key letter A, you're going to issue this thing. Now in the operating system, we call these things an interrupt. So your CPU sits right there, but you could issue interrupts to it, and your CPU is going to respond back to those interrupts. Now, again, let's not really worry about the terminology. We could call it an event, commands, anything, it doesn't matter. The point is that you're sending something to your CPU, and your CPU is going to handle it. And in this way, you're not actually killing one of your cores. Whenever users presses something, you're constantly going to send something to your CPU, and then your CPU is going to handle it in just a second, which is a lot more efficient to do. Now, this is called event-driven. We're issuing commands, we're issuing events, and our CPU is responding to those events. And it does them asynchronously. All right. Now, in the case of Node, it's just like that. You define events, you issue commands, and then you wait and respond back to those using callbacks. Now, here's where the EventEmitter object will come into play. All it does is to give us a way to deal with this asynchronous event-driven nature of Node.js in a little bit better way. Again, it's just a pattern and it makes your code more readable and more manageable. That's all. For example, here, imagine that you have this piece of code, app.onRequest. And what it does is that whenever a request comes into your application, this callback function will run. So, imagine someone on the outside internet specifies your domain name and they send that request. That request is going to come into your computer. Imagine this is the internet, so the request is going to come into your computer. First, it's going to get to your network card. Your network card is going to pass it along to the operating system. The operating system is going to investigate that request and see how to handle it. Now, in this case, that might have a port number like 8000, and that 8000 port number is associated with this Node.js instance, with this Node.js process. So your operating system is going to pass this request to that process, to this Node.js process. Now, in Node.js, this libuv project, this libuv package will kick in. It will get this request, and it will somehow using this events loop thing, execute a callback function, and that callback function will execute this callback function inside of this on method. So, if that last part is a little bit more confusing too, I'm going to elucidate it in just a minute by taking a look at another diagram. So yeah, this is the idea of EventEmitter. Now, whenever someone comes into your code and sees this part, for example, app.on or an object.on, they will immediately understand that that part is there to respond to an event. So that's pretty much it. That's all that this event emitter object does. So here I'm back in my code editor, and again I have my on method, and I'm also emitting that event. So again, remember, I'm going to say this one more time. This is just a pattern, and whenever you're doing this, whenever you're using this on method and this emit method, you're not actually doing anything asynchronously. You're not actually issuing any command. You're not actually reaching to the libuv object or anything like that. To understand what exactly happens when you call this on method or this emit method, let's take a look at another diagram to understand this a little bit better so that you know that this is all just JavaScript. So whenever you're using the event emitter object, you basically have this master object. And when you run the on method like this, for example, on foo and then a function, what you're doing is that you're pushing a function on to this master object. And that's actually all that's happening inside of event emitter. When you run this on method, you're just pushing functions inside of this object. And you could do it multiple times. Or you could do it with a function that accepts a parameter or a couple of different parameters. It's completely fine. And whenever you're doing this, whenever you're calling this on method, you're pushing new functions to that object. Pretty simple, right? And you could also do it with different event names. In this case, we have pushed 3 different functions with the name foo. You can also do it with another name, for example, bar. And if you do that again, you're pushing another function to that object. So this is what happens when you call the on method. Now, when you emit something, when you emit an event, in this case, let's assume that we're going to emit an event with the name foo. In this case, the event emitter is going to go to this master object. It's going to loop through everything that it has, and it's going to run all of those functions associated with this event name. So it's going to run this first function, the third function, and also the last function. And it's not really going to do anything with this last function because the event name associated with that function is bar. And here we're emitting the foo event. And you could do this again multiple times. So you could do it again, and you could do it again. This time you could also do it with a parameter. Now in each one of these cases, you're also again doing the same thing. You're going to this object and you're calling all of these functions with that name. Now, what actually happens is that these functions with the same name are inside of an array. So all of these foo functions are inside of an array. So this is an object, and this object has 2 items inside of it. The first item is foo, and the second one is bar. The foo and both of these 2 are arrays, so they hold arrays. The first one, which is foo, has an array of length 3, and it has 3 functions. We're going to take a look at that in just a minute. So this is really what happens when you run the on method and also the emit method. In this case, we ran the emit method 3 times. So we're going to run these functions 3 times, each one of them 3 times. We could also emit the bar events like this. And in this case, we're not going to touch these functions, these foo functions, and we're only going to run the last function, the bar function. Okay, now let's see this in action. So I'm going to go back to my code editor and run these functions. So in our example, we had 3 on methods. So I'm going to copy paste this 2 more times. This one I'm going to change it to an event occurred 1, an event occurred 2, and for the last one, I'm also going to specify a parameter x. And I'm going to say an event, with a parameter occurred. And I'm also going to log the parameter name like this, x. And I'm going to emit the foo event. Okay, let's run this file and see what's going to happen. So I'm going to head over to my terminal and I'm going to run node app.js. So as you can see, the first function ran, an event occurred 1. Following that, the second function, an event occurred 2, and then the final function with a parameter, an event with a parameter occurred. And we're also logging the parameter, which is, in this case, which is undefined. Now what I could do is to specify a parameter right here, so I could say some text like this. I'm going to run again, and again, those exact functions are going to run, but in this case, this last one is also going to have a parameter to log. So I'm not getting undefined, I'm getting some text. And we could do this multiple times. Let me emit this one more time. So I'm going to say my e.emit foo, and in this case, I'm not going to specify any parameter whatsoever. So think about it for a minute. What's going to happen in this case? How many logs do you think we're going to get? So this emit method is going to go ahead and run all of these functions. Once done, the second emit method is going to run. And this is going to run, again, all of these functions one by one. But in this case, it's going to specify a parameter to each one of them. So let's go ahead and run it. And as you can see, the first emit method ran, and we have undefined because we're not passing any arguments to each one of these functions. And then the second emit method ran, but this time with a parameter. Now again, remember that these will happen in order. So if you change this one with that one, like this, in this case, I'm going to get first an event occurred 2 and then an event occurred 1, because I'm running this prior to this one. Let's run it one more time, and an event occurred 2 always happens before an event occurred 1. Okay. Now in our example, we also had this bar method. So I'm going to define it, my e.on bar, a function like this. And instead of this function, I'm just going to log an event occurred, and I'm going to say just bar like this. And now what I'm going to do is to emit that bar method like this. So my e.emit bar. Let's run it. And sure enough, in this case, we also get that last log, an event occurred bar. Okay, so pretty simple. As you can see, we're not doing anything crazy. We're not talking to libv, we're not doing anything asynchronously. We're just adding functions to an object, and then we're looping through that object and running functions that we want using these emit methods. Now, the on and emit methods are two of the most important methods to understand about this event emitter object, but there are also a couple more methods that could be good to know, like the once method. If we go back to our diagram, if we run object.once instead of object.on, so it acts kind of like the on method. We're still pushing something to this object, but in this case, no matter how many times you emit that event, it's only going to run that function once. So if you say object.emit bar, if you do it 1,000,000 times, this function here is only going to run for one time. So it's only going to run once. So what really happens is that after this listener function runs, after you emit once, this listener is going to get removed from this master object like this. So the rest of the emit functions are not going to have any effect whatsoever. You can only emit it once, and once it runs, that listener is going to get removed. So after the first emit, the rest will be like that you're emitting an event that doesn't exist, that you haven't defined a listener for. If I go back to my code editor and emit this bar method a couple times like this, and I'm going to comment out these two lines. If I run this, I'll get that log for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. So I'm emitting this event 5 times, and I'm running this function 5 times. Now if I change this on to once like this, and I run it again, in this case I'm only going to run that function for 1 time. So yeah, that's pretty much it about event emitters. And we explored the emit method and the on method, which are the two of the most important ones in the event emitter object. And we also talked about the once method. There are actually more methods available on this object, but we're not going to talk about all of them in this video. You could just refer to the Node.js documentation, and all of them are explained pretty clearly. In fact, let's go ahead and take a look at it together. So I'm going to open up my browser, and I'm going to the nodejs.org website, and I'm going to go to the docs, version 16 API, and right here I'm going to click on the events section. Now if you try to read this through, which I highly recommend now that you understand the concept, you'll see that pretty much all of them are pretty easy to understand. Here we could see a very simple example that we just saw, defining a new listener and emitting that event. And of course, if you want to use this keyword, you have to change your callback syntax to use the function keywords rather than using an arrow function. Again, you could read about all of them here in this article. There are also some things to watch out for if you want to use some asynchronous code. And handling errors is also pretty easy with event emitters. All you have to do is to listen on the error event. It's a reserved event name in Node.js. So this error, whenever you want to listen on it, whenever something goes wrong in one of your listeners or when you're emitting something, that listener is going to kick in. Again, read more about it right here. Guess we talked about pretty much all of them, and the rest that we didn't talk about are pretty easy to understand. For example, this new listener, it's just whenever you listen for it and you add a new event on that thing, this function is going to run. Remove listener, add listener, emit, event names. It's kind of intuitive to understand what they do just by looking at the names of these functions. But if you want to understand more about them, please make sure to run the codes, play around with it, and I'm sure you're going to understand what's going on. Okay, I guess that's pretty much it. There's also something else that I wanted to talk about here in this article. If you scroll down, you will see something that is not really related to event emitters, but it's kind of related to events. Actually, it's really related to events, and that's event targets and node event targets. If you read and see what the documentation has to say about them, they're actually just an implementation of the event target web API. So it's just there to make Node.js more standard with other JavaScript versions. If you have used JavaScript on the front end, working with DOM and all of that kind of good stuff, you have used things like add event listener. So this is just there to make it more standard. In fact, if you scroll down, you're going to see a lot of things that says this is not used in Node.js and is provided purely for completeness. So again, that's something that I wanted to mention, but don't really worry too much about this node event targets and event targets. Node.js just has implemented that recently. In fact, I guess it was in version 12 or 14. I'm not quite sure, but it just came in recently. But if you understand the concept behind event emitters, these are actually pretty simple to understand. It's just the same, it's just JavaScript. Nothing too crazy, really. So now I suggest that you come here and focus on this events section all the way to here, up until event target and event API. If you want, you could also read this event target, but I don't really recommend that you make yourself confused about this. Just focus on the event emitter object for now. Okay. Now, as I said before, it's just JavaScript, this event emitter object. There's no magic behind it. You could actually go ahead and implement it yourself if you want. And what I'm going to do right now is to do just that. Now, we're not going to implement all of this ourselves. However, I will show you an implementation that has been done by someone else. So I will give you a link. It's to an article to freecodecamp.org. And the title is How to Code Your Own Event Emitter in Node.js. Now, it shows and demonstrates how you could implement every single last one of those functions. Actually, not every single last one of them, but the most important ones like the emit, once, off, on, and listener account. And here we can see how they are implemented. Now, what I'm going to do actually is to scroll all the way down and grab the complete code. So here's the complete code. I'm going to copy paste this. If I could scroll up here. So we have this event emitter class. I'm going to go to my code editor, actually at my terminal, and I'm going to create a new file called events.js. Exact same name as this one. Actually, the name doesn't matter, but anyway, so I'm going to open that events, my code editor, events, and I'm just going to paste that code in. And right here at the top, I'm going to export this class. So I'm going to say module.exports equals this class. And now what I could do is to go back to my app.js file And right here, instead of including this events file, which is in the Node.js source code, I'm just going to add this before it so that now I am including it off of my custom file. I'm going to save it and run my code again. So I'm going to say node app.js, and we get the exact same result as before. So everything's going to work as expected. Actually, I'm going to uncomment these two lines and run it again, and all is just here as before. So let's go ahead and take a look at the implementation. Here you can see that we're defining that master class. So here's our actually master object, excuse me. So here we have our master object, and here we have our methods. Now the on method that we talked about is when you run this, it's going to run this method add listener, and it's just going to pass along that event name and that function. Now here what we're doing is that we're defining a new array and we're pushing onto that array. So here's where we're defining an array. If it doesn't exist, we're defining it, or we'll just keep having that same previous version of that array, and then we're pushing that new function on top of it. And whenever we emit an event right here, all that's happening is that this function will grab the array from the object that has the key name of this event name, and then it's looping through that array right here and calling all the functions one by one, and also passing the arguments. So imagine we have this master object here. I keep calling it master object. When I'm saying master object, I'm just referring to this object here. It's just a normal JavaScript object. Okay, so imagine we have this object. We have this event called foo, which is just a property of this object, and inside of it we have a couple of functions, maybe two. Now these functions are different, but just go with it right now. This function has its own contents, and this function has its own unique contents, and then we might have another event called bar. This one might only have one function. Now when you're emitting something, for example emitting foo, this function is grabbing this item from this master object. So it's grabbing this array. So this array is going to be fns, and then we're looping through this array and calling every single one of these functions. So that's basically what happens when you emit an event. Just grabbing something from the objects and looping through that thing, which is an array. Okay. And then we also have some other simple methods like the listener count. And all it does is that it will return the length of one of those arrays. So it will grab that again, and then it will return the length. Pretty simple. We also have the once method, which we talked about. And this function will, just like the on method, add that function to one of those properties, and then it will immediately remove that function from that array as soon as we call it. So we call the function and then we remove it. Actually, I realized that this function is kind of buggy, not actually this function, but the remove listener function. If you try to run it, it will not work. And just to show you how it works, right here, I am including this events. Actually, I had to pause the video for a minute or two to figure out what's going on here. So I'm defining this once method and I'm emitting it 5 times. Now you would expect to only get this log for 1 time, but in this code, we're actually getting it multiple times. And it's because this remove listener function doesn't work as expected. Now, a very simple fix that we can do is to just add in one equal sign right here so that we are also checking the first elements in the array. Without this equal sign, we're not checking the first one, so we're calling that function many times. So with this equal sign in place, this bug will be fixed. Now, from now on in the rest of the video, you might see me using another solution, using some toString methods on these two, but that solution is buggy, so don't pay attention to that. You might see that in the rest of the video. Just simply add in one equal sign right here so that we're also removing the first element, and that's it. But anyway, I think this is pretty much it. This is also the custom implementation of EventEmitter. If you want, grab this code and try to play around with it to get a better solid understanding of how the EventEmitter object works in JavaScript. Now, if this piece of code doesn't make a ton amount of sense to you, it actually has nothing to do with Node.js, and it's just related to JavaScript. So you have to understand some concepts like this. What's going to happen if you try to do this, use this syntax on an object? And some other JavaScript concepts like prototypal inheritance, the class syntax. You need to understand that functions in JavaScript are first class, meaning that, for example, you could pass them around as arguments of other functions, just like other primitive types that you pass to functions. For example, here in this on method, it accepts a function as one of its arguments, and then it is passing that to another object, to another function, excuse me. All right, now before I end this video, let's also take a look at the source code of Node.js related to the EventEmitter object. So I'm going to go to the Node.js website right here, and in the event section, I'm going to scroll down and find the source code. Right here, right below the title, it says source code and then a link. I'm going to click on it. It will redirect me to the GitHub, the source code of that file, events.js, which is in the lib folder that we talked about in the Node.js under the hood video. I'll zoom in a little bit and let's try to take a look at the source code. Now, you will realize that this is a lot longer than that custom file that I gave you, almost 1,000 lines of code, but a lot of it is actually error handlings and some extra functions that were not included in that custom file. Now let's try to see what this file is exporting. So I'm just going to search for exports, and you can see that 4 things are getting exported from this file: the EventEmitter objects and the once and on methods as standalone things that you could include, and also the get events listeners. Now please come to this file and try to read it, see some of the patterns that are used, and I guess let's also take a look at the emit implementation. So I'm going to search for emit. Here we go. It's on the prototype of that EventEmitter object. We used the class syntax, but here it's using the prototype syntax, which is just a syntactic sugar. So classes are just syntactic sugar for this prototype. So here the emit function is defined. We're checking for some errors. And if we scroll down, again, more checking for errors. Here we're grabbing that array. So we saw the syntax, we're grabbing that array from that object and we're saving it to this handler. Some more error checking right here, and then I guess we should have somewhere a for loop right here. So we're looping through that handler, as you can see, and we're calling them and we're also passing the arguments. So this might be a little bit more complicated than that simple custom version that we saw previously, but this is just the same concept. For example, here we're calling the apply method, which I don't know if you know this or not. It's again related to JavaScript, and I'm not going to talk about them here. But yeah, this is also the source code of Node.js. It's actually pretty simple to understand. Of course, given the fact that you understand those advanced JavaScript concepts, you could just come to this file and read all these functions and understand pretty well what's going on here. All right. So that's it about this video and event emitters. We'll make use of this object later in the course, as you'll see that it's heavily used in different parts of Node.js. A lot of APIs in Node are actually inheriting from these objects, and therefore we could use methods like the on and emit on them, as we'll see later in the course. And not just the Node.js itself, but also some of the well-known Node.js packages out there also use event emitters. All right, that's it about this one, and I will see you in the next one.